In 2005, hedge fund manager Michael Burry started to see problems with the U.S. housing market and the bond market that underwrote it. And so he decided to bet against that market, buying what is essentially insurance premiums that would pay out in the event that mortgage-backed securities would fall in value. So he'd have to pay out premiums on these insurance policies, but in the event of the collapse that he thought was inevitable, he could make a huge payout. His investors weren't so convinced, and many of them wanted to get their money out, although he was able to head that off. And people thought that he was crazy for betting against the housing market. But of course, in 2007, the housing market started to buckle, and Burry was able to sell off those insurance contracts at a huge profit. His investors should have trusted the promises that he made. He was a very canny investor, but they didn't when they didn't pay out on the timeline that they expected, and they didn't, their own experience didn't suggest that it was going to be a profitable venture. Now, Michael Burry, of course, is a fallible human being. How much more ought we to believe the promises that come from God? But when God promises to do things that our experience says aren't likely to happen, or when they don't happen according to our timetable, how do we respond? In the story we're going to look at today, in the life of Abraham, we see Abraham wrestling with these same problems. So read with me in Genesis chapter 15. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. The word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is of your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go down to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made, literally cut, a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I will give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Now, what God showed Abraham in this story is something that we all need to learn as well. That we must wait for God's promises with patient endurance, trusting that God is incapable of faithlessness. So there are basically 3 lessons that Abraham has to learn. The first is that he needs to trust in God's agency. Abraham's faith in relocating his family from Haran to Canaan shows that when God promised to make Abraham into a great nation, he took God at his word. But over time, the fulfillment of that promise looks like something that's far less certain. And in that circumstance, Abraham basically has 3 options. The first is that he can hold on to hope that God will do exactly what he said he would. The second is he can just give up hope and say, well, God obviously can't or won't do what he promised. And the third is to conclude that maybe God needs him to kind of help matters along a little bit, that he needs to do something in order for God's promises to come through. And Abram appears to have taken option number 3. Eliezer of Damascus has become Abraham's heir apparent because Abraham is taking matters into his own hands. In the ancient world, there wasn't any CPP or old age pensions, no long-term care facilities. The care for the elderly was the responsibility of their children, and this meant that elderly people who didn't have surviving children were in a precarious position. If they were poor, then they had no one to support them financially after they were no longer able to work, and if they had money, like Abraham, there was still the matter of who would care for them in their old age and who would ensure that they got a proper burial. So childless people, if they had the means, could adopt adults as designated children, and then those people would look after them in their old age, and in recompense for that, they would be given the estate. This seems to be the arrangement that Abraham has made with Eliezer. He's Abraham's slave who has been promoted to designated son. God has promised to make Abraham into a great nation, but since Abraham didn't have any kids, Abraham guesses that God must have meant that it would happen through his adopted son. He's not very happy about it, but he's sort of resigned to that idea. This hardly seems like an auspicious start to the great promise that God has given to him. But Abraham took matters into his own hands to ensure that he would get what God promised him, as long as you kind of squint and maybe look at it from a unique angle. But God doesn't need Abraham's human efforts in order to make his plan work. In the ancient world, it was common for people to believe that the gods would require them to do their part for their promises to be fulfilled, but that's just not the way that Abraham's God operates. We can see that in the next story, where Abraham fathers a child with a concubine rather than with his wife, that their human efforts to manufacture a fulfillment of God's promises are unnecessary at best and counterproductive at worst. God's promise is going to be fulfilled by God's agency. In other words, he's going to be the one to get it done. Abraham's job is not to help that along, but to trust that God will do as he says. Now, to his credit, Abraham does believe God when God clarifies that this great nation will be built on Abraham's biological child. Abraham's attempts to make God's promises happen with his help is a temptation that we face too. God's promise, for example, that one of David's descendants would sit on his throne forever led many Jewish nationalists in Jesus' day to assume that they could force God's kingdom to come by provoking a war with Rome, who sat on the throne at the time. Didn't go so well. Today, we see parents who believe that the promise that God will help our children grow up in godly ways, but they try to take matters into their own hands, bringing kids into the faith using intimidation and fear rather than love. And often this alienates kids we're trying to save. We know that God has promised the kingdom, that it will come on earth as it is in heaven. But we try to go about this through the political process. But the thing about the political process is, while legislating morality might feel like we're making progress on God's kingdom, no rules can transform a human heart. God's kingdom isn't then about regulating behavior, but it's about renewing people's hearts. So God's kingdom is dependent on God's transforming action, not on our political activism. But we don't just need to trust that God will be the principal actor in keeping his promise. We also have to trust that God will do it in his timing. So that's the second lesson that Abraham has to learn, not just trusting in God's agency, but trusting in God's timing. Abraham was already 75 years old when God promised to turn him into a great nation. 10 years later, Abraham has great wealth, he's had military victories, but he still has no kids and has no land. And he's feeling pretty raw with God over what happened, because he feels like all of what he's been given is meaningless if he doesn't have a child to inherit it. And now he's an old man, and his wife is an old woman, and he still has no kids. Abraham's complaint basically suggests that he's given up hope. Oh, God, you're back. Remember that time you promised to make me into a great nation? You kind of forgot something. I need kids to make that happen. Thanks a lot. Abraham must assume that God's unwilling or unable to do what he promised. God, for his part, could respond with anger to the implied accusation that Abraham gives, but he doesn't. He understands that the wait has been a tremendous test of Abraham's trust, and that Abraham probably feels as if the promise has been forgotten. So he reaffirms the promise, clarifying a couple of key details. First, he assures Abraham that the plan is not for him to adopt an heir, and that's how the nation's going to happen. It's going to happen through his biological child. And second, he explains that Abraham hasn't yet been given the land because the current resident's sin doesn't yet reach the threshold where dispossession is appropriate, but it is irrevocably heading in that direction. God hasn't overpromised and underdelivered. Rather, the promises are happening on a timeline that just doesn't mesh with Abraham's expectations. God has promised that certain things would happen, but he has not given any sort of a timeline. And Abraham's own sense of what is possible gives him a sense of urgency. He, not unreasonably assumes that most women have had all the children they're ever going to have by the time they've hit their 90th birthday. But God, who isn't limited by what we think as possible, has no such sense of urgency. So God expects Abraham to wait. And the wait is kind of part of the point. If God had given 75-year-old Abraham and 65-year-old Sarah a child, it would have been truly remarkable. But when God gives a child to 100-year-old Abraham and a 90-year-old Sarah, it isn't just remarkable, it is miraculous. God knows that asking Abraham to wait so long is a really difficult situation, but after the miraculous conclusion of that wait, he knows that Abraham's faith will be stronger for it. Abraham, in the story that follows, is willing to sacrifice Isaac at God's command because Abraham has seen God in action and trusts that God is even able to bring Isaac back from the dead. Now, God doesn't just ask Abraham to wait for the fulfillment of promises. He sometimes asks us to wait so that our faith can grow as well. When I was a missionary in Hungary, I worked with something called discipleship training schools. We'd have people, usually from all over Europe and North America, come together, and we would do a 3-month lecture phase where we talked about different theological and biblical topics related to discipleship. And then we would go out on a 2-month outreach following that, putting into practice what we'd been talking about. But when the people first came to the school, we didn't know precisely where they were going to go on their outreaches. That was something that we discerned together over the course of the lecture phase. And so usually about halfway through, we would have nailed down the destinations and made the arrangements so that we could have a budget of what people would need. And at that point, they would start their fundraising campaign. Some of the people had parents that could just write a check, one and done, and it was good. But other people, they didn't have a network of people or somebody who was able to pay the bills, and so they really had to shake a lot of bushes in order to get the money that they needed. They would write to all the people that they've met, all the people that have met the people that they've met. They would reach out to their friends who from richer churches and stuff like that in order to try and raise enough money to go on the outreach. And we, as the organizers, would have to actually start making concrete arrangements before all the money had come in. There were visas to apply for, and there were plane tickets to purchase and hotel reservations that had to be made. And we had to make all this trusting that God would come through for his people. And he always did. People always had the money that they needed to go on the outreach, but it didn't always come with a lot of time to spare. I remember one school in which the last person got the last few $100s that he needed a half hour before they were set to leave for the airport. But because of that, because I saw how God would come through for people in a pinch, then I was better able to have faith, to trust that God would do what he had promised to do. Now, maybe you have a sense that God has made promises to you, and those promises aren't happening. If God has promised you something, he will follow through on it. But sometimes God waits to fulfill his promise so that our faith will grow. I should point out as a little sidebar here that sometimes we impose promises on God, and he's not under any obligation to keep a promise that he never made. God never promised, for example, that the Jews would be able to get revenge on the Romans, even though many Jewish nationalists in Jesus' day thought that that would happen. God doesn't promise to give us a life of health and wealth if we behave ourselves. That's why Job's friends assumed that he was guilty of some sort of malfeasance when his life fell apart, because, of course, if he had behaved himself, God would protect him. God probably hasn't promised to make you rich and famous and to save you from all misfortune. If we assume that just because we want something really badly, that God is committed to giving it to us, then we kind of have forgotten who's God and who's the servant. So, Abraham had to learn to trust in God's agency, to trust in God's timing, and also to trust in God's grace. After all, will God follow through on his end of the bargain if Abraham doesn't prove to be a faithful partner? If God was only on the hook to follow through on his promises if we performed flawlessly, well, then he could promise whatever he'd like because he'd never have to keep the promises. But we get an insight into God's faithfulness in that strange covenant-cutting ceremony that we see at the end of the chapter. The ceremony seems pretty weird for a modern reader, but the ancient people would have understood this. Normally, two people entering into a solemn agreement would cut the animals in half and place the dismembered carcasses on either side, and together they would walk up through them to symbolize a sort of a calling of curses down on themselves, to say, if I violate the terms of the covenant, then may this happen to me. But there's a significant difference in this case, because rather than both parties to the covenant walking through between the pieces of the dismembered animals, God alone does it. God commits himself to fulfill his promises no matter what Abraham does. This is a unilateral covenant. And in the stories that follow, we see God working through Abraham's descendants, even the flawed ones. I mean, Jacob is a con man. Moses is a murderer. David is a murderer/adulterer. Ehud was left-handed. That's pretty shady. Saul of Tarsus was the chief of sinners. And of course, there are setbacks along the way. There's the 40 years wandering around in the desert. There's the Israel-Judah divorce. There's the Babylonian exile. But God never abandons his commitment to bless Abraham's descendants or to bless the nations through them. In fact, God does one better than that. Of course, in walking through these carcasses, God says that he'll suffer a gruesome death if he's ever unfaithful to his promises. But when Israel proves to be an unfaithful covenant partner, God takes the punishment, the horrible death, onto himself. God himself went through the severed animal carcasses because it would be God who paid the price for Israel's unfaithfulness. And we have entered into this same covenant, grafted into the family of Abraham by faith. As Paul tells us in Galatians 3, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. We are heirs to Abraham's promise and recipients of God's Spirit, because of what God has done for us. And while there are consequences when we fall short, God's purposes will never be stopped. He will bless the world through us. And that blessing depends not on our faithfulness, but on his grace. So when we are tempted to believe that God's promises don't apply to us because we are sinful, fallen, broken people, we need not worry. God has paid the price for our unfaithfulness. His promise to us remains in effect even when we are not faithful. God's promises may seem like they're a long time coming, but let's hold on to them and not doubt. God has promised to be present with us for the rest of the age. God has promised that faith in Jesus is sufficient to atone for our sins. God has promised that when we seek his kingdom above all, he will provide our basic necessities. God has promised that even though we will die, in Christ we will live again. Though we don't see these things happening, and even though sometimes they look impossibly far away, we can trust that the God who showed himself faithful to Abraham continues to show himself faithful today. So let's trust against all odds, because it is God in whom we trust.